I had never been one to scare easily. I grew up in the country, spending nights alone in the woods, listening to coyotes howl in the distance while I sat by a fire. But something about that cabin changed me. It started with a simple favor. My uncle owned a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was old, built sometime in the 1940s with thick logs and a slanted tin roof. No electricity, no running water, just 4 walls, a fireplace, and a well out back. He hadn't been up there in years and wanted to sell it, but needed someone to check on it first. See if it was still in good enough shape to list. I had some time off work and figured it wouldn't hurt to get away for a few days. A little isolation never bothered me, and I could use a break from everything. I packed my truck with some supplies, food, water, my rifle, a lantern, and drove up early in the morning. The last 10 miles were on an old logging road, barely more than 2 tire tracks cutting through thick forest. The trees felt closer here, leaning in like they wanted to swallow the path. The deeper I drove, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my tires on gravel and the occasional creak of tree branches shifting overhead. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like I remembered. A single-room structure with a covered porch, a rusted axe stuck in the chopping block out front. The windows were filthy, the door covered in scratches, probably from raccoons or maybe even a bear. I parked and got out, stretching my legs. The air smelled damp, like moss and rotting leaves. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The key was right where my uncle said it would be, tucked in a crack between 2 logs near the doorframe. The inside was just as simple as I expected. A cast iron stove against one wall, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against the far corner. The fireplace was filled with old ashes, and the walls were lined with shelves holding dusty cans of food and rusted tools. The first thing I did was check the roof for leaks. Everything seemed fine. The walls were solid, and the floor only creaked in a few places. It was musty but dry, which was better than I had expected. I spent the afternoon cleaning up, sweeping out dust and cobwebs. By evening, I had a fire going in the stove and was sitting at the table with a can of chili, listening to the woods settle in for the night. Then I heard it, a single thump against the back wall of the cabin. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, listened. Nothing. Maybe a branch fell. Maybe an animal brushed up against the logs. I wasn't worried, but I kept my rifle close, just in case. An hour later, another thump. Louder this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, sweeping the beam along the tree line. The woods were pitch black, silent. I waited a few minutes, then went back inside and locked the door. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, rustling in the leaves. More thumps against the walls, always just far enough apart to keep me on edge. By morning, I was exhausted but convinced it was just animals. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon trying to get at some old food left behind. But then I saw the footprints. They were just outside the cabin, in the soft dirt near the back wall. Human footprints, barefoot. They led from the woods, stopped right at the wall, then disappeared back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My uncle hadn't been up here in years, and I sure as hell hadn't walked around barefoot. Someone had been out here, watching. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the tree line every few minutes. I thought about leaving, but the sun was out, and I told myself it was probably some drifter passing through, maybe even an old squatter. I decided to stay one more night, just to finish up what I came here for. As the sun set, I made sure my rifle was loaded and locked the door. I kept the fire low and sat at the table, listening. The first sound came just after midnight. Not a thump this time, but a dragging noise. Slow, deliberate, right along the outside wall. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. The noise stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then a whisper, right outside the window. I didn't move, barely breathed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Wind? An animal? But I knew better. The whisper came again. Soft, unintelligible. But there. I raised my rifle and aimed at the window, my finger hovering over the trigger. If something moved, I'd fire. I sat like that for what felt like hours, my arms shaking. At some point, exhaustion won. My eyes shut for just a moment. When I woke up, the sun was rising, and the door was open, just standing there, slightly ajar. My hands were cold, my body stiff. I bolted up, rifle still in my lap. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, every inch of me screaming that something was wrong. I checked outside. The footprints were back, more of them this time, leading from the trees to my porch. And then, the worst part, a set of prints leading back inside. I didn't pack, didn't think. I just grabbed my keys, my rifle, and ran to the truck, threw it into reverse and tore out of there so fast my tires kicked up dirt. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I called my uncle from a gas station an hour later, told him I wouldn't go back. He sold the cabin a month later. Never went up to check it himself, never asked me why. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know this, whoever it was, they were in that cabin with me, watching, and they left without a sound. The first thing I noticed about the cabin was the smell. It was damp, stale, like wood that had been left to rot in the rain for too long. The kind of smell that sticks to your clothes, seeps into your skin. I had rented the place for a long weekend, thinking it would be good to get away from the noise of the city. I wanted quiet, a break from everything. The drive up had been long, mostly winding roads through dense woods, barely another car in sight. I had no cell service by the time I turned off the main road onto the gravel path leading to the cabin. That didn't bother me. I had expected it. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. A single-story structure, dark wood, an old stone chimney. It looked sturdy enough, though the windows were fogged over with dust and grime. I had booked it online through a small rental site. The pictures made it seem cozy, rustic. In person, it felt off, the way abandoned houses do, even when you know someone has been there recently. Inside, the air was thick. I left my bag by the door and went to open the windows. They resisted at first, the frames swollen with age, but I forced them up. The fresh air helped, but not much. The cabin had the basics: a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a single bed with a thick quilt, a wood-burning stove in the corner.
No TV, no Wi-Fi.
That was fine. I had brought books, a notebook, enough food to last the weekend. I planned to read, maybe hike a bit, clear my head. By the time I had unpacked and started a small fire in the stove, the sun was setting. The trees outside turned dark, shadows stretching long across the dirt path leading to the cabin. I sat in the old armchair by the stove, listening to the fire crackle. It was quiet, too quiet. I hadn't realized how used to city noise I was until then. No sirens, no distant hum of traffic, no voices. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt wrong, like I was waiting for something. That night, I slept badly. Every sound felt amplified in the silence. The wind against the cabin walls, the rustling of branches outside. I must have woken up a dozen times, each time staring into the darkness, listening. I didn't know what I was listening for, just something. At some point, I heard footsteps outside, light, slow, moving just beyond the window. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but my body knew better. The way my heart pounded, the way my breath caught in my throat, I knew it wasn't an animal. I didn't move, didn't even sit up. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to stop. It did eventually, but I didn't sleep again after that. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Not paw prints, footprints. Bare feet, the toes digging slightly into the damp earth. They circled the cabin, leading from the tree line, stopping just below my window. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My first thought was that maybe someone had been out here before me. Maybe they had wandered around, left these behind. But they looked fresh, too fresh. I went inside, locked the door, sat in the armchair and tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that it was nothing, that I was just overreacting. The second night was worse. I stayed up late, reading by lantern light, unwilling to let the darkness settle in too soon. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, not circling, stopping, right outside the door. I held my breath. The door had a lock, but it was old, flimsy. I listened. The footsteps didn't move, just stayed there, standing, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring at the door. At some point, the footsteps moved again, slow, deliberate, around the cabin, back to my window. I didn't look, couldn't, but I felt it. Someone standing there, just beyond the glass, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, the footprints were there again. More of them this time, closer. I packed my things. I didn't care if I had booked the cabin for another night. I didn't care that I had to drive hours back to the city. I just wanted out. As I threw my bag into the car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. Something moved in the trees, a shape just beyond the edge of my vision. I didn't wait to see what it was. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, other people. Only then did I start to breathe again. I never found out who or what had been out there, and I never went back. It was my brother's idea. He called me one afternoon, said he found a cheap rental in the woods up north, and that it'd be good for us to get away for a few days. No cell service, no distractions, he said. Just us, the quiet, and the trees. I should have said no. Instead, I packed a bag, stocked up on food, and met him at a gas station off the highway, where we loaded our things into his truck and drove another 45 minutes into nowhere. The road narrowed as we went, the trees closing in, the light dimming. By the time we reached the cabin, I already felt uneasy. It was old. That was the first thing I noticed. Not just old, but neglected. The wood was dark and warped in places, the front steps sagging under their own weight. The windows were small, streaked with grime. There was a chimney, but no smoke came from it. The whole place felt wrong. My brother killed the engine and sighed, stretching. Come on, man. It's not that bad. I didn't say anything. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and something else. Something I couldn't place. The furniture was sparse. A couch covered in an old sheet, a wooden table, 2 chairs. There was a small kitchen, a single bathroom, and 2 bedrooms with creaky twin beds. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The woods outside were dense, no wind, no movement. Even the usual sounds, crickets, birds, the rustling of leaves were absent. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something I couldn't name pressing down on me. My brother snored in the next room, completely at ease. I envied him for that. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. Maybe a sound, maybe a feeling. The cabin was pitch black, the air thick. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. A single creak came from the front of the cabin, near the door. I held my breath, my body stiff. Another creak. Someone or something was on the porch. I turned my head slowly, trying to see into the hallway. The door to my room was cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of darkness. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. Then, a sound that sent a bolt of ice through my veins. The door handle turned softly, almost testing. Not an accident, not the wind. Someone was trying to get in. I sat up, my breath shallow. My brother's door was still closed. He hadn't heard it. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't sleep. I just sat there listening. Morning came. My brother got up, stretched, yawned. Man, I slept like a rock. I didn't tell him. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the old wood shifting in the cold. But that day, something felt different. The trees seemed closer, the silence heavier, the cabin darker, even in daylight. That night, it happened again. A creak on the porch, the handle turning, but this time something else. A breath, soft, slow, right outside my door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the darkness. Then, footsteps, not leaving, moving, through the cabin. I heard them pass by my brother's door, then the kitchen, then the living room, then silence. I wanted to check. I wanted to grab a knife, wake my brother, do something, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, locked in place, until the first light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the walls. My brother found me in the kitchen, gripping a cup of coffee like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "You look like hell." I told him everything. He frowned. "You're sure?" I nodded. He sighed, rubbing his face. "All right, let's check it out." We walked the perimeter of the cabin, checked the doors, the windows. No signs of forced entry. The ground was hard, covered in old leaves.
No footprints.
"Maybe it was an animal," he said. "A raccoon or something." I didn't believe that, not for a second. That night, we locked the doors, wedged a chair under the front handle. My brother kept a bat next to his bed. I kept a knife. I lay awake, listening. Nothing. Then, sometime past midnight, creak. The chair at the front door shifted. The handle rattled. I held my breath. Then, a knock. Soft, gentle, knuckles against wood. 3 times. Then silence. The next morning, we packed our things and left. Neither of us spoke until we were miles away, back on the highway, the cabin a distant memory in the rearview mirror. "We're never going back there," my brother said. I nodded. We never spoke about it again. I never planned to spend the night in that cabin. It wasn't even on my mind when I left home that morning, heading into the mountains for a quick hike before the cold fully set in. But things went wrong. They always say to check the weather before you go out into the wilderness. I did. It was supposed to be clear, cold but manageable.
No storms, no surprises.
That turned out to be wrong. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was empty, the air crisp, the world silent except for my boots crunching on frozen leaves. I'd done this hike plenty of times before, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. The sun was out, but it didn't bring much warmth. Still, it felt good to be out there, away from everything. Work had been hell, life had been dragging, and I just needed some time alone. Then the snow started falling. It wasn't a slow drift of flurries. Came fast, thick, cutting off my view of the trail almost immediately. I checked the forecast that morning, nothing about snow. But here it was, and within minutes, the temperature dropped sharply. I wasn't dressed for this. I had layers, but they weren't enough for a full-on snowstorm. I turned back, trying to follow my own footprints, but the wind and snow covered them almost instantly. My phone had no signal. That wasn't a surprise. There was barely any reception this deep into the woods, but now it meant I was well and truly on my own. I kept walking, hoping I was still on the right path, but everything looked the same. The trees blurred together in the whiteout, and the cold bit through my jacket like I wasn't wearing one at all. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, with dark wood and a sagging roof. The windows were covered in grime, but the door was slightly open, swinging gently in the wind. I didn't care who owned it. I just needed shelter. I stepped inside, pushing the door shut behind me. It wasn't much warmer inside, but at least the wind was gone. The place was a single room, a cot against one wall, a rusted wood stove in the corner, and a small table with a chair. The floor was covered in dirt, leaves, and old footprints. Someone had been here recently. I found a pile of firewood near the stove and some matches on the table. Whoever stayed here before had left in a hurry. Their footprints led to the door but not back in. I tried not to think about that as I worked to get a fire going. The wood caught, the flames flickering weakly at first, then growing stronger. Heat slowly filled the cabin. I sat down in the chair, rubbing my hands together, my breath still visible in the dim light. The storm raged outside, but I was safe, for now. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The footprints in the dust weren't just from one person. There were two sets, one coming in, one going out. I stood up slowly, looking around. There was no sign of anyone else, no bags, no food, nothing that suggested someone had been living here. Just the footprints, old but clear in the dirt. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe someone had used the cabin for shelter like I was doing now. Maybe they left before the storm hit. But why had they come in and left so quickly? And why did the second set of prints look different? I pushed the thought away. I was just being paranoid. The cold, the isolation, it was getting to me. I needed rest. I laid down on the cot, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind howled. Then I heard it, a soft crunching noise. At first, I thought it was the wind shifting the snow, but then it came again. Closer, footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up slowly, listening. The fire was the only light in the cabin, casting long shadows on the walls. Another crunch. Closer, right outside the door. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. The door wasn't locked. I hadn't even thought to block it. The wind outside screamed, rattling the cabin walls. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I forced myself to stand up as quietly as possible. I reached for the poker by the stove, gripping it tight. Then suddenly the door burst open. I don't remember much of what happened next. I swung the poker, hitting something solid. A grunt, a heavy body crashing against the table. I ran past them, into the storm, into the freezing dark. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until I collapsed in the snow. I don't know how long I lay there before I saw headlights cutting through the storm. A truck. A man helped me up, wrapped me in a blanket, asked me what happened. I couldn't speak. He took me back to his cabin, miles away, gave me hot coffee, and let me sit by the fire until I could breathe again. When I finally told him where I had been, his face went pale. "There's no cabin up there," he said. I wanted to argue, but I knew better. I had been there. I had felt the warmth of the fire, seen the footprints in the dirt. But when they took me back the next morning, there was nothing, just trees and snow.
No cabin, no footprints.
Just the storm and the feeling that I had barely made it out alive. I never wanted to go to the cabin. It wasn't even mine. It belonged to my brother, James, and he'd been trying to get me up there for months. "You need a break," he kept saying. "Go clear your head. Get away from work." I didn't argue. Maybe I did need a break. My job was killing me, and I was barely sleeping. But the thought of sitting alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere didn't sound relaxing. It sounded like hell. Still, I went. I packed light. A duffel bag with some clothes, a book I'd probably never read, and enough food to last me the weekend. James had told me the place had everything I needed. Running water, electricity, even Wi-Fi, but I wasn't planning on using my phone much. That was the whole point, right? To disconnect. The drive took longer than I thought. The last 20 miles were nothing but dirt roads winding through thick trees. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up. The cabin was small, just one story, with a wraparound porch and a roof that sagged a little in the middle. It looked older than I expected. James said he'd fixed it up, but it still had that abandoned look, like no one had really lived in it for a long time. The first thing I noticed was the silence.
No birds.
No wind through the trees. Just quiet. Too quiet. I told myself it was fine. I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods, that's all. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The living room had a couch and a fireplace, and the kitchen was small but clean. There was only one bedroom with a queen-sized bed and a window that faced the trees. I checked the bathroom, running water just like James promised. Everything seemed normal, but I still felt uneasy. It was like the walls were holding their breath. That first night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the nothing outside. No wind, no animals, just dead silence. Every little noise made my skin crawl. The creak of the wooden floor, the faint rustle of the trees outside. I kept telling myself I was being stupid, that I was just jumpy because I wasn't used to being alone like this. But then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it. A footstep, outside, right near the porch. I sat up, heart pounding. Another footstep, slow, heavy, like someone was trying to move quietly but wasn't doing a good job of it. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. Nothing, just darkness. I forced myself to get up and check the front door. Locked. I even pushed against it to make sure. My truck was still parked outside, untouched. I stood there for a long time, listening, but the footsteps never came back. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, something harmless. That's what I told myself as I finally went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was mostly dry, covered in leaves, but near the porch where the dirt was soft, I saw them. Footprints, not an animal, person, and they weren't mine. I tried to stay calm. Maybe a hiker got lost and wandered near the cabin. But why would they be out here in the middle of the night? And why didn't they knock or call out for help? I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I went for a walk, chopped some firewood, tried to read that book, but my mind kept going back to those footprints. By the time the sun started setting, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone standing in the trees, just staring. But there was never anyone there. That night, I locked every door and window. I even dragged a chair in front of the door just in case. It didn't make me feel any safer. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Right outside the bedroom window. Slow, steady breathing. Too close. I held my breath, barely moving. The sound went on for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't hear footsteps leaving. Just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, holding a kitchen knife I'd grabbed earlier. My truck keys were in my pocket. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to step outside. Not yet. I waited for the sun to come up. As soon as there was enough light, I grabbed my stuff and ran to my truck. As I threw my bag into the passenger seat, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, and that's when I saw it. The bedroom window, the one right next to where I'd been sitting all night. The glass was fogged up, like someone had been standing there, breathing. I didn't stick around. I started the truck and tore down that dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never told James what happened. Never told anyone, really. I just said the cabin wasn't for me. He still goes up there sometimes. Says it's peaceful. Says I should give it another shot. But I never will. It started when I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a weekend alone. I needed the break. Work had been brutal. My apartment felt suffocating, and I just wanted quiet. No people, no city sounds. Just me, the trees, and the wind. The drive up was uneventful. It was one of those long, winding roads where you don't see another car for miles. The trees closed in on both sides, dark and thick. The sky was overcast, but it wasn't supposed to rain. I had printed directions since there was no cell service this deep in the woods. The cabin was isolated, exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, it was smaller than I expected but looked sturdy. A single-story structure with a steep roof, dark wood, and a small porch. There was a wood pile stacked neatly by the side. The key was under the mat, just like the owner said. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. A fireplace sat against one wall, a small kitchenette to the side, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was clean, but clearly hadn't been used in a while. I dropped my bag on the couch and walked around. The place was simple. One bedroom with a creaky wooden bed frame, a thin mattress, and a single window looking out into the trees. The bathroom was small, just a toilet, sink, and shower with a curtain that looked a little too thin. I settled in quickly. I had brought enough food for the weekend, a couple of books, and my old radio since I had no service. As the sun started setting, I made a fire, cooked some kin soup, and sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me. The silence was almost overwhelming, but I liked it. The first strange thing happened that night. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I didn't know why. The room was pitch black. I reached for my phone, but the screen was dead. I had forgotten to charge it before I left. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, shuffling steps. I sat up, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But then I heard something else. A faint creaking sound, like weight shifting on wood. The porch. Someone or something was standing on the porch. I didn't move. I just sat there listening. The footsteps didn't come closer. They just lingered. Then, after what felt like forever, they moved away. Slow, deliberate steps back into the trees. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I went outside, half expecting to find footprints. But the ground was covered in dead leaves, and I couldn't see anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Still, I locked the door that night. The second night was worse. I woke up again, this time to a different sound. A faint tapping, not on the door, but on the window.
Top, top, top.
Slow, steady. I sat up, my chest tight. The window was covered by a thin curtain. I couldn't see outside, and I didn't want to. The tapping stopped. Then, after a long pause, I heard breathing, heavy, just on the other side of the glass. I stayed completely still. My mind raced. I wanted to turn on the lamp, but I was too afraid. The breathing stayed for a few seconds longer, then faded. In the morning, I checked the window. The glass was clean.
No marks. No smudges.
No proof of anything. I wanted to leave, but I had paid for the weekend, and I told myself I was just letting my imagination get to me. The isolation was making me jumpy. That's all. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the couch with the fire burning low, every muscle in my body tight. At some point past midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps, not outside this time, inside. A slow creak of the wooden floor. Couldn't breathe. I stared at the hallway leading to the bedroom, my whole body frozen. The sound came again. A step. Closer. I gripped the poker from the fireplace, holding it tight. My eyes locked on the dark hallway. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Then silence. Long, unbearable silence. I sat there for hours waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. By morning, I was done. I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't care about the rental agreement or the fact that I had planned to stay another night. I got in my car and drove, heart pounding, gripping the steering wheel too hard. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Later, when I calmed down, I tried to think logically. Maybe it had been the house settling. Maybe I had been half dreaming. Maybe I had scared myself into hearing things that weren't there. But I know what I heard, and I know I wasn't alone. I never should have agreed to the trip. It started with a simple suggestion from my coworker, Greg. He and a few guys from work had this tradition of renting a remote cabin every winter for some time away from the city. They'd drink, hunt, fish if the lake wasn't frozen over, and just unwind. I wasn't really the outdoorsy type, but Greg insisted it was exactly what I needed. It's peaceful out there, he said. No phones, no traffic, no stress. Just fresh air and silence. Silence. That was the part that got to me. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization, with nothing but trees and darkness pressing in around me. But I went anyway. I don't even know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. Maybe I just didn't want to seem like a coward. The drive took longer than I expected. The road twisted through miles of dense forest, the trees stretching so high they blocked out most of the fading daylight. My tires crunched over a fresh layer of snow as I followed Greg's directions. No GPS out here. No cell service either. Just handwritten instructions and a rough idea of where I was going. The cabin was small, older than I thought it would be. Dark logs stacked together, a stone chimney poking up from the roof, and a small front porch with a single rocking chair. There were no other cabins nearby, no sign of life anywhere. I half expected the guys to already be there, maybe unloading firewood or setting up inside. But there was no one. I stepped out of my car, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The place was completely silent except for the occasional creak of tree branches shifting under the weight of snow. I checked my phone again. No signal. I walked up to the door and pushed it open. The inside was simple. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and old furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. There were 2 small bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a single bathroom. I dropped my bag near the couch and went to check the fireplace. The guys weren't here yet, and the place was freezing. I found some logs stacked beside the hearth and got a fire going. The crackling flames made the space feel a little less empty, but something still felt off. Maybe it was the quiet, or the way the trees seemed to press in through the small windows. I tried to shake it off and settled into one of the chairs to wait. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and the shadows stretched longer across the wooden floor. I checked my watch. They should have been here by now. I stood up and went outside. My footprints were the only ones in the snow. No tire tracks, no signs that anyone else had been out here recently. I had a sinking feeling in my gut. Back inside, I tried the old landline phone on the wall. Dead. I sat down, staring at the fire, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe they got held up. Maybe they decided to go somewhere else and forgot to tell me. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Then I heard it, a soft crunch outside, like a footstep in the snow. I froze. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Someone was out there. I moved carefully to the window and peered out. The porch was empty, but beyond that, the trees stood thick and dark. I squinted into the shadows, but I couldn't see anything. Another crunch, closer this time. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I had no weapons, no way to call for help. Just me, alone, in a cabin that suddenly felt much smaller than before. The sound stopped. Silence stretched out, long and suffocating. Then, a new sound. A slow, dragging scrape along the side of the cabin, like something was being pulled through the snow. It circled toward the back, and I realized whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were staying close. I grabbed the fire poker and moved toward the back door. My hands were sweating despite the cold. I didn't want to go outside, but I also couldn't just sit there and wait. Then the doorknob rattled. I jumped back, gripping the poker so tight my knuckles ached. It wasn't the wind. Someone was trying to get in. I held my breath, waiting. The rattling stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe they'd given up. Then a single, deliberate knock. I didn't move. Another knock, louder. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever was on the other side wasn't saying anything. No calls for help, no introductions. Just knocking. Then the knocking stopped. A long silence followed before I heard footsteps retreating into the snow. I waited, barely breathing, until I was sure they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, the poker still clutched in my hands, listening to every creak and whisper of the wind outside. Morning came slow. The gray light seeped through the trees, casting long shadows over the snow. I forced myself to open the door and step onto the porch. The snow was disturbed, footprints leading from the trees to my door and then back again. But something was off. The footprints weren't made by boots. They were bare human feet. I didn't stay to find out more. I grabbed my bag, tossed it into my car, and drove as fast as I could back down that winding road. I never told Greg or anyone else at work what happened. I don't think they would have believed me. Hell, I barely believe it myself. All I know is I'll never go back, and I'll never, ever ignore that feeling in my gut again. Something was out there that night, watching me, waiting, and I don't think it was ever planning to leave.